3 Apache girls laughed at the silent rider, never knowing their father, the chief, would bind them to him in a pact of honor that would heal his broken heart. "We will not speak to him," one sister whispered. "We will endure." The wind tore through the barren plain, dry and merciless. It was a wind that knew nothing of pity, a force that stripped the land down to its bones, leaving only dust and rock and the gnarled skeletons of juniper trees. Silas felt it on his skin, a familiar sting that echoed the permanent chill inside him. His homestead was a lonely outpost against the vastness, a small, stubborn scar on the face of an unforgiving landscape. The log cabin was sturdy, built with his own hands, but it was not a home. It was a shelter, a place to close a wooden door against the world that had taken everything from him. He worked from the pale winter sun's first light until the slate evening sky descended, his days measured by the swing of an axe and the ache in his weary shoulders. The silence was his only companion, a heavy blanket he wrapped around himself. It was broken only by the creak of floorboards, the distant howl of a coyote, or the clinking of his tin cup as he set it down on the rough-hewn table. He chopped wood deep into the night, as if splitting his own guilt into manageable pieces. On the hill overlooking his cabin were 2 small mounds of earth, marked by simple wooden crosses. His shovel, its blade kept clean and sharp, rested against the cabin wall, a constant, unobtrusive reminder of the work that was finished but never over. He was a man hollowed out by loss, his heart a dusty, empty room where memories flickered like a smoky lamp. He asked for nothing and expected less. From his ridge he sometimes saw them, the Apache. They moved with a grace the land itself seemed to afford them, a part of the landscape he could only exist upon. He watched them not with fear or prejudice, but with the detached observation of a man who no longer felt he belonged to any world. He noted their quiet dignity, the way they endured the same biting wind and dusty sun that wore him down. Among them, he had often seen the 3 daughters of the chief Black Hawk. The eldest, Lena, was fierce and proud, her gaze direct and challenging. The youngest, Sora, was shy, a shadow that clung to her sisters. And then there was the middle one, Nita. She was the quietest of the 3, her movements deliberate, her eyes holding a calm, watchful intelligence. He saw them once by the creek, their laughter carrying on the wind, a sound so alien in his world of silence that it felt like a physical blow. They had seen him, a solitary figure on the ridge, and their laughter had turned his way. It was not cruel, he knew, but the curiosity of youth directed at the strange, silent white man who lived like a ghost. He had simply turned away, the sound of their mirth fading as he retreated back into his fortress of solitude. He did not know it yet, but a life he could not imagine was about to be tied to his, not by force or by bargain, but by an act he was driven to by the very ghosts he sought to escape. The day it happened began like any other, with a frosty air that cracked underfoot and a sun that offered light but no warmth. Silas was checking his snares when he heard the cry, a sharp, panicked sound that cut through the deep fog clinging to the valley. It was the sound of a child. He froze, his body rigid. The ghosts of his own past stirred, a cold dread seeping into his bones. He told himself to turn back, that it was not his concern. But the cry came again, weaker this time, followed by the frantic shouts of men. Against every instinct that had kept him isolated for 3 years, he moved toward the sound. He found Black Hawk's young son, no older than 7, his leg caught and twisted in a rockslide near the riverbank. The boy's father and 2 warriors were trying desperately to free him, their efforts only causing the loose shale to shift dangerously. Silas saw the terror in the chief's eyes, the raw fear of a father about to lose a child. It was a look he knew intimately. Without a word, he crouched, his own tired eyes that have seen everything assessing the rocks. He pointed, his gestures calm and deliberate, showing them where to brace the larger stones, how to use leverage instead of force. He worked alongside them, his hands sure and earthy, his presence a steadying force in their panic. For a long hour, they toiled in the biting wind, the only sounds the scrape of rock and their own ragged breaths. Finally, with one last coordinated heave, the boy was free, Silas examined the leg, his touch gentle, and determined it was broken but clean. He splinted it with branches and strips of his own shirt, his movements efficient and practiced. He had done this before. In another life, Black Hawk stood before him, the child safe in his arms. The chief's face was a mask of weathered granite, but his eyes held a profound, unspoken debt. Silas simply nodded, expecting nothing, and turned to walk away, back toward the silence of his cabin. He wanted no thanks, no reward. He only wanted the quiet to settle back over his soul. But the chief's voice stopped him. "You have done a great service for my people. An honor debt must be paid." Silas did not turn around. He just kept walking. He did not understand that for a man like Black Hawk, an honor debt was more binding than any law. 3 days later, they appeared at his door. The three sisters, Lena, Sora, and Nita, stood in the dusty clearing before his cabin, carrying small bundles of their belongings. Behind them, Black Hawk sat on his horse, his expression unreadable. Silas stepped onto his porch, his face grim. He knew, before a word was spoken, that this was the payment. "They will tend to your home," the chief announced, his voice carrying the weight of command. "They will cook your food, mend your clothes. My honor is satisfied by binding my house to yours. You are now a brother to our tribe." It was not a question. It was a declaration. Silas stared at the three women. Lena's eyes burned with resentment. Sora trembled, hiding behind her sister. Nita's gaze was steady, watchful, but revealed nothing. She simply endured. This was not a marriage of passion, but a political and spiritual arrangement he had not asked for, a consequence of an impulsive act of kindness that violated the careful emptiness of his life. He wanted to refuse, to shout that he wanted nothing, to be left alone with his ghosts. But he saw the rigid set of their shoulders, the exhaustion in their stance. To send them back would be to shame them, to shame their father. It would be an act of cruelty. He remained silent. Then, "If you want to stay." He left the sentence hanging in the cold air, turning and walking back inside, leaving the wooden door open. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with misunderstanding and resentment. He heard their soft footsteps in the dust as they approached the cabin. He heard them enter. He did not look up. A new kind of silence had begun, one filled with the breathing of four people who were not a family, in a cabin that was not a home. He didn't know it yet, but his first true home was right in front of him. The first weeks were a careful, silent dance of avoidance. The sisters moved through his small cabin like wraiths, their presence a constant, low hum of activity that grated on his nerves. He was used to the absolute stillness of his solitude, and now there was the soft sweep of a broom, the clink of a pot on the stove, the rustle of fabric. They spoke only to each other, and only in their own tongue, their voices low and conspiratorial. He retreated further into himself, his silence becoming a wall. He ate the food they prepared, simple, honest meals of corn cakes and stewed rabbit, leaving his tin plate by the dry sink without a word. He chopped twice as much wood, needing the punishing labor to quiet the noise in his head. He spent his days outside, mending fences, checking traps, doing anything to avoid the confined space of the cabin. At night, they slept on pallets by the hearth while he lay in his cot, staring into the darkness, feeling like an intruder in his own life. The separation was absolute. He saw their worn-out shoes, the thinness of their blankets, the way they shivered when the evening chill crept through the chinks in the logs. A part of him, the part that had saved the boy, felt a pang of something he refused to name. He was their protector in name, but a stranger in fact. One afternoon, he returned to find Nita trying to mend a split seam in her shoe with a blunt bone needle. Her hands were deliberate, but the leather was too tough. He saw the frustration she concealed behind her calm expression. That night, after they were asleep, he took the shoe. In the pale light of the moon, he worked with his own tools, his weathered hands moving with a forgotten skill. He stitched the seam with strong thread, oiled the dry leather, and reinforced the sole. Before dawn, he placed the mended shoe quietly by her pallet. When he rose later, The shoe was gone. He saw her wearing it. She did not look at him. She did not acknowledge the gift. But as she walked, her step seemed a fraction lighter. He had intervened secretly, a cautious gesture that asked for nothing in return. It was a crack in the wall of his own making. The secret interventions became a quiet routine. A thicker, warmer blanket appeared folded on Sora's pallet one frosty morning. A small pouch of medicinal herbs he recognized from his own past appeared on the shelf, the kind his wife used to use for calming teas. He would find a pail of water already drawn from the well when he went out at dawn, or a stack of kindling perfectly sized for the stove. He knew it was Nita. She was the only one who watched him with that steady, discerning gaze. She saw where he was worn down, just as he saw where they were in need. They were communicating through actions, a language of unobtrusive care spoken in the vast silence between them. He never acknowledged her gestures. She never acknowledged his. It was a fragile truce, a bond woven from threads of mutual, unspoken observation. The change came with the blizzard. It descended from the mountains without warning, a churning wall of white that swallowed the world. The biting wind howled, rattling the wooden door and driving snow through every tiny crack. For 3 days they were trapped inside the cabin, the space shrinking around them. The oppressive silence was magnified, charged with a new tension. On the second day, Sora fell ill, her body trembling with fever. Lena's pride crumbled into frantic worry. She tried her remedies, but the fever only climbed. Silas watched, his gut twisting with a terrible, familiar dread. He saw the image of another small body, hot with fever, another life he had failed to save. This time he would not stand by. He pushed past Lena's defensive posture and crouched by Sora. His hand on her forehead was firm, his touch diagnostic. He recognized the signs. He went to his own small chest and removed a sealed tin. Inside were the last of his wife's medicines, powders he hadn't had the heart to use or throw away. He mixed a dose with water and, looking at Nita, held out the cup. He needed her trust. Lena protested, but Nita looked from his raw, honest eyes to her suffering sister. She took the tin cup and gently coaxed Sora to drink. For the rest of the night, he and Nita worked together, bathing Sora's head with snow water, forcing sips of the medicine into her. They moved around each other with an unspoken understanding, their shared purpose dissolving the walls between them. In the gray light of dawn, the fever broke. Sora was weak, but she was breathing softly, her sleep now peaceful. Lena wept with relief. Nita looked at Silas, her eyes conveying a gratitude so profound it needed no words. He simply nodded, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion and a strange, unfamiliar lightness. The storm had broken something open between them. As winter thawed into a tentative spring, a new rhythm settled over the homestead. It was still quiet, but the silence was no longer heavy with suspicion. It was a comfortable, shared space. Sora, fully recovered, now smiled at Silas, a small, shy tilting of her lips. Lena's pride had softened into a grudging respect. She still kept her distance, but the hostility in her gaze was gone. The connection grew strongest between Silas and Nita. They still rarely spoke, but their shared language of gestures had deepened. He would leave a rare prairie flower on the table. She would leave a perfectly stitched patch on his worn-down jacket. Their lives were intertwined in 1,000 small, domestic acts. The past, however, was not so easily left behind. One afternoon, a rider approached the cabin. It was Jedediah, a coarse, broad-shouldered trapper who sometimes traded with the tribe. His eyes, small and greedy, took in the scene. The tidy cabin, the smoke curling from the chimney, the 3 Apache women. He dismounted, a cruel smirk on his face. "Well now, Silas," he boomed, his voice a violation of the peace. "Heard you went and got yourself a whole family. Chief Black Hawk's finest, eh?" He winked, looking the sisters up and down as if they were livestock. Lena's back went rigid. Sora shrank behind the water barrel. Nita stood her ground, her face impassive, but Silas saw the way she lowered her gaze, a flicker of humiliation in her eyes. Jedediah laughed. A harsh, ugly sound. Cost you a pretty penny, I bet. Or did you just trade some blankets for the lot of 'em? Good for keeping a man warm on these cold nights. I reckon the insult hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Nita flinched, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but Silas saw it. Something inside him, a protective instinct he thought long dead, rose like a storm. He stepped forward, placing himself between Jedediah and the women. He was silent for a long moment, his presence more powerful than any shout. Jedediah's smirk faltered. Then Silas spoke, his voice low but carrying with absolute authority. There with me, he paused, his gaze locking with the trappers. Not bought. Chosen, he took another step, his shadow falling over the other man. This is their home. You will show them respect, or you will not be welcome on this land again. The crowd of mocking townsfolk from the profile was distilled into this one man, and the salvation was just as potent. Jedediah, unnerved by the cold fire in Silas's eyes, stammered an apology and backed away, hastily mounting his horse and riding off. The clearing was silent again. Silas turned. Nita was looking at him, her defenses finally, completely gone. Her eyes were shimmering with unshed tears. He did not move to comfort her. He just stood there, a guardian. She stayed. In the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, the final walls crumbled. That evening, as a slate sky deepened into night, Silas found Nita on the small porch, looking out at the vast, dark land. The wind whispered through the dry grass. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer a void but a vessel, holding everything they couldn't say. It was she who broke it first, her voice soft, unsteady. My mother. She died when Sora was born. My father never spoke of her again. He thought it would make the pain less. She paused, breathing in the cool air. But silence doesn't make it go away. It just gives it more room to grow. Silas swallowed, the sound loud in the stillness. He looked toward the hill, where two lonely mounds sat beneath the stars. He had never spoken of them, not to anyone. Now, the words came, raw and difficult, as if pulled from a deep wound. My wife, and my daughter. His voice was rough with disuse. Fever. I was away, trading for winter supplies. When I got back, he didn't need to finish. The guilt was a palpable thing, a weight he had carried until his shoulders were permanently stooped. Nita listened, her gaze filled with a compassionate understanding that went beyond pity. She knew the shape of loss. She had lived with its echo her entire life. She saw the shovel that always leaned against the cabin, and for the first time, she understood it was not just a tool but a penance. When he fell silent, lost in the memory, she did something that years of cautious distance had made unthinkable. She reached out and her hand rested gently on his forearm. It was not a gesture of romance, but of profound human connection, an anchor in a shared sea of sorrow. The touch was light, but for Silas, it felt as if it held the power to piece his fractured soul back together. He did not flinch. He did not pull away. He simply breathed, feeling the warmth of her hand against his skin. They were no longer alone. From that day forward, the homestead began to transform. The quiet work continued, but now it was filled with a shared purpose. It was no longer his homestead and their labor. It was their home. Lena, seeing the deep, unspoken bond between her sister and Silas, found her own peace. Her pride became a fierce loyalty to their new family, and she took charge of the gardens with a warrior's determination. Sora's shyness bloomed into a gentle joy, her laughter now a frequent sound as she helped with the chickens or played with a stray dog that had wandered onto their land. The alliance her father had forced upon them had, against all odds, become a sanctuary. Silas began to change in ways he never thought possible. The deep lines of grief around his eyes softened. He still spoke little, but his silence was now a comfortable quiet, not a tormented one. He started carving in the evenings, not out of a need to distract himself from his guilt, but for the simple pleasure of creation. He fixed the worn-down wooden door so it no longer creaked. He built a sturdier table, one big enough for all of them. Nita was the center of this new world. Her calm, dignified presence was the hearth around which they all gathered. Her relationship with Silas grew not in grand declarations, but in the soil of daily life. It was in the way he brought her the first spring wildflowers, and the way she saved him the best piece of bread. It was in a shared glance across the dinner table, a silent conversation that spoke of trust, respect, and a growing, tender affection. They were two people who had been defined by what they had endured, and together, they were realizing they were strong enough to build something new. The love between them grew slowly, quietly, like a hardy plant in the desert, taking root where no one was looking. They had found in each other a matching silence, a shared strength. One evening in late summer, Silas brought a new piece of wood onto the porch. It was a solid, beautiful piece of seasoned oak. For weeks, he worked on it, the scrape of his knife and the tap of his mallet becoming a familiar evening song. Nita would watch him, her hands busy with mending, a small, knowing smile on her face. He was not carving a toy. He was not carving a tool. He was carving a rocking chair. It was a simple, honest design, sturdy and reliable, with a smooth, curving grace. It was a piece of furniture made not for a memory of a child's cradle, but for the comfort of a woman. When it was finished, sanded smooth as river stone, he did not present it with a flourish. He simply carried it inside and placed it by the hearth, in the spot where Nita usually sat on a hard stool. The direct-to-audience moral now felt earned. For love does not always arrive with a thunderclap. Sometimes it grows in the quiet places, nurtured by small gestures and unspoken understanding. It flourishes in the space between two lonely souls who, by tending to each other's wounds, find they have cultivated a garden. From the dust of loss and the silence of grief, a family had taken root on the unforgiving plain. He looked at Nita, the firelight catching the gentle strength in her eyes. He said only 2 words. "For you." She stood up and walked to the rocker, her hand tracing the smooth, warm wood. She sat down, and the chair moved with a soft, gentle rhythm. To fit her perfectly. She looked up at him, her gaze clear and full of a quiet, profound love. "This is a good home, Silas," she said softly. He nodded, a true, small smile finally reaching his eyes. The ghosts on the hill were quiet. Winter was coming again, but this year the cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was filled with warmth. It was full. From dust and silence grew a home. From closed hearts, a family. The pact of honor, born from a chief's desperate gratitude and a silent man's unwilling acceptance, had become a bond of genuine love, proving that the strongest ties are not those of law or tradition, but those woven thread by thread through shared hardship and quiet dignity. Silas, the stoic cowboy lost to his grief, found his redemption not in forgetting his past, but in building a future with Nita, the resilient survivor who taught him that a quiet heart could still learn to speak the language of love. He had carved a rocker, a symbol not of what was lost, but of the gentle, enduring comfort that he had found. The open window of their cabin no longer let in just the biting wind, but the sounds of a thriving life and the promise of a shared tomorrow. He didn't need to make a grand declaration. The simple words, "Stay here," had been spoken in 1,000 different ways and answered with 1,000 acts of faith. If the story touched you, like warm light in a cold night, then carry it with you. Remember that strength is often quietest, that dignity is its own armor, and that even the most broken hearts can be mended, not by grand passions, but by the steady, unobtrusive presence of someone who chooses to see the person underneath the pain. True connection is not about filling the silence, but about learning to share it. Subscribe to our channel for more stories full of silence, courage, and genuine closeness. And tell us what moved you the most. Was it the secret mending of a shoe, the quiet defense against a bully's scorn, or the final, simple gift of a carved rocking chair? We'll see you again, where silence means home.